obviously, it's been a really busy week for me. I've been packing up, I've been preparing to go to the Better Discourse 3 event, and at the time that this video is likely to be published, I will in fact be in Dallas, Fort Worth, Texas for the event. Thank you to everybody who actually came out to the event, even though it hasn't happened yet at the time of me recording this video. But obviously, I couldn't go without covering this story. This is the last video that I'm going to shoot before I get on my plane and take off, because the clemency hearing for Julius Jones happened on November 1st, and Julius Jones testified in his own clemency hearing. But more importantly than that, because he was terrible in his testimony, the prosecution leveled every single aspect of the case that we've been covering for so long. Now, we're going to get into this, but I do want to say, for those of you who have been watching and following this around, at the end of this video, I have a message for you that I would like for you to stick around for, but we'll get into that later. Let's first talk about the case, because obviously we have to go over it, because there's a big push by the media to say that Julius Jones is innocent. And the first thing we're going to go to is the first thing that we always go to, is Megan Tobey's description. But there is something that I want to point out about Megan Tobey's description that doesn't get as much coverage as it should. Because Megan Tobey showed up to the clemency hearing. She showed up to the pardon and parole board hearing, the other hearing where this board voted to grant clemency to Julius Jones. Now, their vote is non-binding. It kicks the decision over to the governor. It is a recommendation. But when the board is in the tank for somebody like Julius Jones, we knew the result of the hearing was going to be bad. But remember, the whole case, ever since the DNA evidence that they were talking about in the last defense proved that Julius Jones was in fact wearing the bandana, despite the fact that, according to his testimony, he never wore any bandanas at all.
I did not commit that crime. I did not wear bandanas back then. And
okay.
No bandana that connected me to that robbery.
Is now contingent on this deliberate misinterpretation of Megan Tobey's description. And the way we know that this is a deliberate misinterpretation of Megan Tobey's description is because Megan Tobey will tell you herself what she was talking about when she was describing the hair, the ½ an inch of hair from the ear area to the top of the skull cap herself today.
And although that description, Megan says, has been misconstrued, her testimony never changed.
There was a small amount of hair showing from the top of his ears to his stocking cap, about ½ an inch I could see, meaning there was ½ an inch from the top of his ear to his stocking cap. They have said, I have said that he had ½ an inch to an inch long hair and it was sticking out. Now they are saying I said the shooter had inch long hair. And that's not what I said.
Now, obviously, when Megan Tobey describes a skull cap that is over Julius Jones's eyebrows and then goes over his ear, she's talking about the bit of hair that is visible right around the sideburn area up to the skull cap. This is not long hair sticking out. She says this is not long hair sticking out. And this is what the prosecution is trying to emphasize. This is what the family is trying to emphasize. And this is what the defense is trying to counteract. Because the defense is alleging, of course, that Christopher Jordan, Chris Westside Jordan, is the perpetrator of this murder. But Megan Tobey specifically at trial denied seeing braids, denied seeing cornrows, and was clearly describing Julius Jones. But what I found interesting is that I've laid this out for you. I played the video of Megan Tobey laying it out for you, and Megan Tobey has showed up to both of the hearings in front of this board to testify what I just told you about what she saw on that night. The thing is that the pardon and parole board never bothered to ask her a question, and that's how you really know that the fix is in this hearing. If the whole case hinges on her description, and the pardon and parole board vote based on the idea that they think Julius Jones is innocent, you would think if they were trying to determine in a genuine way whether or not Jones was innocent, they would ask the key witness, due to the key thing that's in dispute, whether or not she was describing braids or whether or not she was describing two-dimensional space, aka what she was actually describing. And yet, they didn't ask her a single question in either hearing because they already knew the way that they were going to vote, and this was proven out time and time again by the last hearing and by this hearing, because the prosecution completely slayed everything that Julius Jones has put forward. Julius Jones himself was caught in multiple different lies in this hearing that we're going to go over a little bit later. The DNA on the bandana that was in Julius Jones's room that matched the murder weapon that was described by Megan Tobey, along with the white shirt with the black trim that was also described by Megan Tobey, was found in Julius Jones's room. Independent witnesses place Julius Jones wearing that stuff before the murder, Megan Tobey during the murder, and another witness right after the murder who is not connected to this operation. It was a neighbor of one of Jones's co-conspirators after the fact, somebody who was going to help him sell the car after the fact, all placed Julius Jones wearing this stuff. And Jones is claiming he never wore the bandana, he never saw the bandana, even though his DNA matches the bandana, and the bandana was wrapped in the murder weapon. Now, you guys get this. We've been over this a bunch of different times, but we've also talked about other things in the case that point to Julius Jones's guilt. First and foremost, we talk about his girlfriend who testified against him. His girlfriend that Julius Jones sent a threatening letter to, and this, by the way, was brought up multiple different times during this hearing, because there's a bit of a conspiracy from the defense, who, by the way, the fact that they could just lie about every aspect of this case is really frustrating, not only in the public, but in the hearing, because they assert that this letter doesn't exist. They said Julius Jones never wrote this letter, and the prosecution has never provided this letter to the defense in any way. So they're basically arguing that the threats that Julius Jones sent from jail never happened.
Quote, lead counsel also erroneously believed that Julius had written a letter to his girlfriend at the time, Annalise Presley, stating that he was on the south side of Oklahoma City at the time of the shooting. But no such letter has ever been produced.
But there's a couple of problems with that. Number one, during the prosecution's presentation, they actually did in fact present the letter. So the letter does exist, obviously. They weren't making up the letter. It was introduced in court. Just because in the document they produce a printed version, something typed up, doesn't mean the original letter does not exist.
Suffices to point out that Mr. Jones knew what a devastating witness Miss Presley would be. For that reason, he attempted to silence her. In one letter, he told her that, for her safety, she needed to say she did not remember anything. And he advised her that, quote, they can't arrest you or charge you with nothing for saying that, okay? If you don't believe me, ask an attorney, any attorney. I need you to hurry and write me back so I know you got this and you understand, okay? End quote. He's desperate. In a second letter, he warned, quote, do not tell them people that I was doing anything illegal, okay? Just tell them you really don't know what I was doing, and if they bring up your past statements, just say you don't recall that, end quote.
And number two, Julius Jones admitted to sending this letter and another threatening letter to his girlfriend. And he said that he did so because he was trying to ease her concerns.
Mr. Jones, you wrote a letter to Miss Presley that said, so you're going to have to do something for me now for your safety. Not that I'm threatening you, but I got some, and I'll skip the wording there. If you do get called to the stand, and this is November 21st of 1999, your best bet is to say you don't remember unless you don't care about me coming home. You agree you wrote that letter, sir?
Yes, sir. But the reason I said what I said was because I was attempting to try to shield her from what I know she was afraid of.
Okay.
It was ill-advised in my youth, but I was not threatening her.
You can certainly see how that looks like you're trying to get her to coach or change her testimony. You can see how that might be read that way, correct?
Yes, sir. But again.
And then again, Mr. Jones, in November 3rd of 2000, you wrote a letter that says, and if you do end up having to testify, do not tell them people that I was doing anything illegal, okay? Just tell them that you really don't know. You wrote that letter as well, did you not, sir?
Yes, sir. Are you finished asking me a question?
I'm asking you, did you write that letter?
I'm asking you, are you finished asking your question so I can fully answer it, sir?
Yes. Did you write that letter?
Yes, sir. Again, as I said.
Doesn't it ease your concerns when a known gang member, a member of the Bloods in prison, a violent guy, sends you a letter that says, for your own good, I got some stupid ass family, I'm not threatening you, but you better just say that you don't recall or you don't remember because you can't get in trouble unless you're not concerned with me going home? Doesn't that sound like it's a loving and caring letter? And of course, the reason why that Jones would send that letter to his girlfriend is because his girlfriend identifies the murder weapon as being in Jones' possession. When she was going through his car, she found the silver gun that matches the description of the gun that was used against Paul Howell. And she says that Jones told her that was her gun. She also found it with a red bandana. His girlfriend also identifies Jones as giving her gold chains and those gold chains being connected to jewelry store robberies where Jones, with a bandana over his face, just like the murder of Paul Howell, pointed a gun at people and robbed them of their jewelry. And the prosecution doubled up on the timeline presented by the girlfriend by showing pawn receipts that coincide with her seeing the jewelry and receiving one of the chains from Julius Jones.
And Gino Chambers said that Jones stole gold necklaces on more than one occasion from more than one jewelry store. The pawn slips more than corroborate the overwhelming evidence that Mr. Jones was an habitual thief. Between January of 1998 and February of 1999, Mr. Jones pawned a gold chain consistent with what Gino Chambers reported, and so much stereo equipment and so many telephones and other electronics that I don't have time to list them all. On July 9th, 1999, just less than 3 weeks before he killed Paul Howell, Mr. Jones robbed a jewelry store at Quail Springs Mall at gunpoint, wearing a red bandana, and he stole gold chains. He was connected to this crime, yes, by Christopher Jordan, and also by a witness who saw the cutlass leave the parking lot. But also, Annalise Presley testified that Mr. Jones gave her 3 or 4 gold chains and then took them back. Sure enough, on July 15th, 1999, Mr. Jones pawned 3 10-carat neck chains. And on July 21st, 1999, he pawned another chain. Interestingly, Ms. Presley did not, in her recent interview, try to back away from her admission that Jones had given her these gold chains. Her testimony and the timing of these pawn slips prove that Julius Jones is lying when he says he has never been violent.
On one occasion, she was presented by Jones with a couple of gold chains. One of them was given to her, the rest Jones took back with him. The day after this presentation to her, Jones has pawn receipts for the number of gold chains that Presley identifies. And after he took back the one gold chain that he did give her, there's a pawn receipt the next day in Jones's name for a gold chain. So her testimony was absolutely devastating to Julius Jones, which is why, again, he wrote the threatening letter that the prosecution has been asserting is evidence of guilt and the defense has been claiming didn't exist the whole time, that Jones himself admits to writing. Now, this hearing is much worse for Julius Jones than you can possibly imagine, because Jones has been lying this whole time, and he's gotten so comfortable lying that he can barely acknowledge when he's caught in a lie, even when it happened seconds before. Remember, Jones said that he was never allowed to testify at his trial. He said, "Look, I couldn't even testify at my trial. What even is the right to testify at the trial?" And all these appellate courts and all the lawyers and all these people just somehow violated his rights, and it was never noticed. Remember, this was adjudicated through 13 appellate courts and refused by the Supreme Court 4 different times. You would think if he was actually prohibited from testifying in his own trial, a major constitutional violation, that one of these appellate courts would have been like, yeah, we should have let him testify. But of course that didn't happen. As we talked about multiple different times on this channel, one page of the court transcript shows 4 different times Julius Jones being asked if he wants to testify and him saying of his own volition that he wouldn't testify. But Jones has an excuse for that. It's a terrible excuse, but let's hear him say it himself.
You stated that you were shocked when the defense was arrested and you didn't get to testify, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And that you had a hearing in front of Judge Jerry Bass, and I'll just read it to you. You were sworn in at that point, correct? Sworn to tell the truth?
Yes, sir. After my lawyer had already arrested. Yes, sir.
The court says, Mr. Jones, you heard Mr. McKenzie announce that the defense was resting. Your answer is yes, sir. The court says, well, we've all had some discussions about whether or not you were going to testify. We've all had some discussions about whether or not you were going to testify. And that means you're not going to testify. Is that correct? You answered correct. And then the court said, all right, you understand that your right to testify is a personal decision of your own. Of course, you may have the advice of counsel, but it is a personal decision whether to testify or not testify on your behalf. Have you determined with the assistance of counsel not to testify? You answered yes, sir. And the court said, is that a free and personal decision of your own? You said, yes, sir. And then finally it says, has Mr. McKenzie or anyone else put any pressure on you, coerced you, or made any promises or any benefits to testify? And you said, no, sir. And then your answer was that the question was that this is a choice of your own free will. Your answer was, yes, sir. Is that a pretty accurate description of that hearing?
Yes, but it's leaving out the connotation of what I said a while ago, is that My lawyer had informed me before the trial not to show a whole bunch of emotion in front of the jury. So I was terrified to say anything other than what he advised me to say. I don't know the law. I didn't know the law, especially back then. I was only 20, 21 years old. So I did what he told me to do.
I'm sorry, I don't want to talk over you, sir. Were you finished?
Yes, sir. I just said I did what my lawyer advised me to do because I was terrified.
Okay, so you didn't say anything at that hearing because you didn't want to appear emotional or upset in front of the jury?
Yes, sir, because this is what he advised me before the trial.
So when I was watching this video, I could feel in my heart that the one good member of the Pardon and Parole Board, the one good member who denied Jones these hearings, voted to do so, and voted to not grant clemency to Julius Jones, was setting him up for a great fall, and he definitely does, because Jones asserts that the reason he said that he didn't want to testify, and the reason he acknowledged that he didn't want to testify multiple different times in the court of law, is because his lawyer advised him to not look bad in front of the jury. However, there is one crucial and devastating problem with that.
So you didn't say anything at that hearing because you didn't want to appear emotional or upset in front of the jury?
Yes, sir, because this is what he advised me before the trial.
Okay. Mr. Jones, the jury wasn't present at this hearing. That hearing was outside the presence of the jury. Those hearings are always outside the presence of the jury. The jury wasn't there.
When he asked me this, we were standing in the courtroom, sir.
No, but that hearing was outside the presence of the jury, sir. They weren't there. You could have shown whatever emotion or said whatever you wanted to. There was no jury present.
No, sir, that's not true.
Yeah, that's right. Under Oklahoma law, the jury is not present during the part of the trial where they ask the person whether or not they're going to testify. And the reason why is because you're not supposed to hold against the defendant him deciding to or to not testify, because you have a constitutional right to do either in your own trial. So in Oklahoma, to remove bias by law, they remove the jury from that situation so they can't observe you deciding not to testify, because even though we all know intellectually you're not supposed to hold that against a person, they feel like in Oklahoma that should be removed from the equation at all because, you know, emotions take over in a trial. Now, what does Julius Jones do in this situation when he's caught lying in this case? He just pivots to saying, oh, well, I didn't want to look bad on the judge, and I don't know how trials work.
There was no jury present.
No, sir, that's not true.
It is true, sir. All those things are always outside the presence of the jury. Those discussions are improper to be had in front of a jury.
No, sir, I'm saying that I did not want to show emotion in front of the judge as well. I was terrified.
In front of the judge?
Yes, in front of that. I don't know how court proceedings work. I haven't been in courts like this.
So now your testimony is that it was the judge you were concerned about.
I'm telling you, we were in the courtroom when he asked me these questions, sir. We weren't in the judge's chamber.
Yes, sir. I understand that, but the jury wasn't there.
He just completely changed what he said without acknowledging that he was caught in a lie in this very scenario, which is absolutely amazing. And what's great about this is that Julius Jones's lawyers have been smearing the Howell family. They've been smearing Edmond. They've been smearing Oklahoma's court systems, everybody as racist and evil and as framing Julius Jones. And if they had spent, one day in an Oklahoma court, they would have known that by law, this wasn't a thing that could have even been possible that their client was alleging. They would have known that he was lying and not set him up for such failure. But since they don't practice in Oklahoma, they're actually licensed in the state of Arizona. They just assumed that the jury was present in this situation, and they look like total asses in this moment. On top of that, we have the issue of the Mercedes robbery, which, again, Julius Jones was caught lying about because Jones pled guilty to the Mercedes robbery because they found a stolen Mercedes in Julius Jones' apartment complex parking lot. And again, the robbery was conducted in a very similar way to the carjacking of Paul Howell. Obviously, nobody was shot, but during this carjacking, Jones, with a red bandana over his face and something covering his head, pointed a gun at somebody, that silver gun that was used to murder Paul Howell, and carjacked their car and then drove it to his home where the police eventually found it. And the great thing about this is that Jones just says, oh, his lawyer screwed him over and there was no evidence tying him to the crime, which is absolutely nonsensical, but it just goes to show you what kind of a terrible liar Julius Jones is.
Yes, sir. I ended up pleading guilty to that crime because I originally was represented by Mrs. Gina Walker, who had left the office. And upon her investigation, she was trying to get those charges dismissed because there was really no evidence that I committed that crime. But when they took me back to court in 2006, when I pled guilty to this, I had a new lawyer who I hadn't had for more than 30 days. And the judge told me I was going to trial on Monday. And that wasn't her problem, that I had just got a new lawyer. And I felt the pressure that I had to, because I didn't want to take the chance of getting, convicted of another crime I didn't commit.
Okay, so you pled guilty to that? Yes. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, Jones. You pled guilty because you were caught dead to rights, because you were a serial carjacker, because that's who you are. You were a violent criminal, and you had done this carjacking 6 days before you murdered Paul Howell.
Yes, sir. Are you finished asking me a question?
I'm asking you, did you write that letter?
I'm asking you, are you finished asking your question so I can fully answer it, sir?
Also, take note of Julius Jones's attitude throughout this hearing. Remember, clemency is all about asking for mercy. Does this sound like somebody who's asking for mercy? This sounds like somebody with an attitude problem. He's like, oh, are you done with your question? I want to answer it fully. Like, just throwing out all this anger and vitriol that should be red flags for the Pardon and Parole Board, but of course it isn't because they're activists in the tank for Julius Jones. But what's great about this is that this one Pardon and Parole Board member, this one guy who's actually concerned with the truth, who's actually read over the documents, who actually hasn't bought into the propaganda, nails Julius Jones dead to rights on this Mercedes robbery.
And you stated that there was no evidence that was found linking you to that crime, yet the car was found at your apartment complex in Norman, correct?
That's what I'm told. I have never seen that vehicle. I've never been in it.
Okay, you have no reason to dispute that it was found and seen at your apartment complex.
Again, I've never seen it, so I don't know if that's what the police report say, and that's what the police report say. So.
And at that particular crime, you pled guilty and you spelled the word Mercedes with a Z. That is exactly like the tag that was in the car, also spelled with a Z. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
Okay, so there is some evidence linking you to that crime.
No, sir.
Okay.
To answer
the crime that you pled guilty to, you were wearing a bandana. If believed that you pled guilty to the crime, you were wearing a bandana over your face and you pointed a gun at Mr. Lapsey and took that vehicle, which later ended up at your apartment. Is that correct?
I didn't catch all of what you just said, sir. Could you repeat it?
Absolutely. So when you say there was no evidence linking you to that crime, there was evidence linking to the crime, correct? In at least enough that you pled guilty to it.
Again, sir, I explained to you that I had just got a new lawyer, and the judge told me that she was not going to give us any more time.
Okay.
That is the reason why I felt the pressure to plead guilty to that crime. I did not commit that crime. I did not wear bandanas back then. And
okay.
There was no bandana that connected me to that robbery.
So in 1999, when Julius Jones carjacked this doctor for the Mercedes, he forged a registration document to make it seem like it was his vehicle. However, Jones, not the brightest bulb, we know that from his 0.8 GPA, actually spelled Mercedes with a Z instead of an S on the registration form.
As if two eyewitnesses weren't enough, an employee at Mr. Jones's apartment complex in Norman saw him driving the Mercedes and park it near his apartment. Another employee who believed the Mercedes was at a place called police, who recovered the car. And Mr. Jones had prepared a fake paper tag on which he spelled Mercedes, Mercedez. Finally, Mr. Jones pled guilty to this crime. And how did he spell Mercedes in his plea paperwork? Mercedez. I really hope you will ask Mr. Jones about this crime, which he continues to blame on Christopher Jordan, and he blames his guilty plea on ineffective assistance of counsel. There's a pattern here.
a clear and obvious indication that this guy's an idiot and that the car registration is not legitimate. However, Jones pled guilty to this crime in 2006. Something like 7 years later, Jones pled guilty to this crime. And in his written version of his plea in order to get the plea deal, Jones spelled Mercedes the same exact way. The dude had 7 years to learn how to spell Mercedes, and he didn't do it, and his plea deal, ironically, ties him to the crime, even though he says he pled because he didn't want to be convicted of another crime he didn't do. If you were ever curious on why Julius Jones never testified in front of a court of law, this is exactly why. Because Julius Jones shot himself in the foot multiple different times. He went with that same ridiculous alibi that they were having a big plate of spaghetti and a birthday cookie, even though in a hearing where Julius Jones could have testified and did not testify.
And Mr. Jones could have testified at the evidentiary hearing if his alibi is true, but he chose not to. I suspect it's because the alibi is completely untrue. Mr. Jones's family claimed they were all home, including Jones, and that a family friend was there with her son. But this friend has repeatedly and adamantly denied under oath that they were in the home on the night of the murder. And her son was unavailable at the evidentiary hearing, but he signed an affidavit confirming they were not there. And as I've already stated, Mr. Jones did not tell Annalise Presley that he was home, but that he was on the south side at the time of the murder. And yes, that really was said. You have it right there.
Brenda Cujo, the independent witness that they said could verify Julius Jones's alibi, was able to produce a receipt because she said she went to Kinko's before going to the Jones house for the Jones birthday celebration that dated this event the day before the murder, thus excluding this alibi from viability in a court of law. Jones has no response to that. All he can do is lie repeatedly time and time again.
As you can see, the narrative Jones and his defense team has fed the media is absolutely false. While Mr. Jordan is certainly responsible for his own participation in the murder of Paul Howell, it is Mr. Jones who was a career violent criminal. I've recently heard it said that Mr. Jones was spending time with Mr. Jordan because Mr. Jordan was troubled and Mr. Jones was trying to help him. But the opposite appears to be true. This slide depicts Mr. Jones's contacts with police from 1995 through the murder of Paul Howell. It does not include the ATM incident or the robbery of the jewelry store or the Lexus carjacking. And this reflects Christopher Jordan's contacts with police. In 1997, he had a curfew violation. The middle entry is a car accident, and there's a grand larceny on July 2nd, 1999. So ask yourselves, which one of these two individuals was in trouble with the law before they became best friends?
Also, another fantastic point that is worth mentioning is that the prosecution actually put up Christopher Jordan's criminal history versus Julius Jones' criminal history, because one of the arguments made by the Innocence Project, his lawyers, and all the advocates for Julius Jones is that he's a good boy, he never got into trouble, and Chris Westside Jordan was the troublemaker. But when you see the criminal record, what you find out is Julius Jones has been committing crimes and acts of violence since he was 15 years old, well before this supposed summer association with Christopher Jordan. However, Christopher Jordan's arrest record actually coincides with the association. So Jones was actually the bad influence. If they haven't lied about enough stuff already, this is just one more piece of evidence that shows that Julius Jones cannot tell the truth, and everything about this campaign to free him is a lie. Now look, we've been over this case multiple different times. You guys know by now that the DNA matches Julius Jones. The odds of another African American on the bandana that the murder weapon was wrapped in Julius Jones's crawl space in his closet, contributing to that DNA, are 1 in 110 million. There were 35 million African Americans in 1999 at the time of the trial, so it's a significant multiple of people you would need, and they would also have to have access to Julius Jones's bedroom. And considering Julius Jones says he never touched the bandana, he never even wore bandanas, the fact that his DNA is on it and that DNA is wrapped in the murder weapon is evidence of his guilt. And for those of you who are saying Chris Jordan planted the DNA, remember, the DNA tested in 2018 was using new techniques. It was a type of DNA that they couldn't really find back in 1999 at the time of the crime. So this DNA that might have existed theoretically in the mind of some scientists was definitely not something that Christopher Jordan was aware of and would have been able to plant Julius Jones's while removing his own, because according to Jones, Jordan was wearing the bandana despite the fact that his DNA is not on it. So there's no way that this could have been planted. It's absolutely ridiculous and absurd to assert that. And again, Julius Jones just proves by all the other evidence that he's guilty and incapable of telling the truth. However, that doesn't stop crappy organizations from advocating for Julius Jones, and conservative organizations that ought to know better from advocating for Julius Jones. I actually saw the official CPAC Twitter account tweet out that Julius Jones needs to be free. And I'm going to leave this in the description of the video so you guys can go out and give them a piece of their mind, because they should know better. They should know better that this is unacceptable behavior, and it's absolutely ridiculous that they would be advocating for Julius Jones, who's 100% guilty of this murder.
Finally, there's one more piece of evidence that we didn't know until recently existed. Mr. King, Mr. Jordan, and James Stevens have all reported that Jones told them that a little girl waved at him as he approached the car.
When we pulled up in the driveway and, stopped, and my dad had kind of cracked the door open, I looked over. I was sitting right behind him, right behind my dad. I was in the back seat, right behind the driver's seat. And I looked over and saw Julius Jones walking up to the car. I saw him walking up, and I remember waving because I'm a child. I don't know what's about to happen. I just remember kind of waving, and then he literally shot my dad in the head and did not say a word.
Look, I've mentioned in previous videos covering this story that this case says a lot about who we are as a nation and who we are as a people. Julius Jones murdered Paul Howell. He murdered him for a Suburban that street value would have been $4,000. And remember, you would have had to split that $4,000 between him, Jordan, and the other people involved in selling the car. So he murdered Paul Howell in front of his children in cold blood without saying a single word for about $2,000. And I know in $1999 that might seem like a lot more money, but it's definitely not worth a human life. He did this. It is undeniable. The DNA evidence ties him to this. The witness testimony, the description, the excellent description by Megan Tobey ties Julius Jones to this. And after he murdered Paul Howell in cold blood for an SUV that Paul Howell would have obviously turned over to Jones, he fired at Tobey and his daughters leading into the house. That's the kind of guy he was. After he murdered Paul Howell in cold blood, he thought, maybe I can murder this sister and some young children so that I can get away with it and hopefully make that $2,000 in $1999. This is obvious. It is clear. However, what was going on in this country right now is you have a big political movement trying to get people out of prison, and specifically people who are black that kill white people. And the way that they do it is to smear them as racist, as bigots. Imagine the horror that you have to go through, not only as a family and as a community, after somebody comes into your community, murders you in front of your kids, and then the community goes on trial as evil and racist.
The victim was white, middle class, gunned down by a young African-American male in a wealthy suburb of Oklahoma City.
Edmond was over 85% white back in the 90s.
When integration went full swing, many whites left Oklahoma City, and Edmond was one of the areas they moved to in record numbers.
It wasn't filled with gangs or filled with crime. People moved to Edmond to live a safe life. We can go to Edmond and protect our families.
Possible gang elements coming to Edmond and murdering a successful white man. It had everybody on edge.
There was a fear at that time that was almost palpable of dangerous young black youth. The feeling was, if we don't act swiftly, and if justice isn't severe, we're all in danger.
The family goes on trial as evil and racist. Like, do you really believe that Megan Tobey, who maintains that she described Jones, cares that Jones is black? She cares about the fact that this guy killed her brother. It didn't matter if he was black, white, whatever. The fact is, he was killed in front of his kids and in front of his sister, and that's why they're so vehement that this guy needs to pay for the crime. It has nothing to do with race, and it's absolutely ridiculous, again, and I say this over and over again, when the defense's hypothesis is that it was Christopher Jordan, the other black guy, as the shooter, that they would even try to invoke this, but they're trying to stain this because they know if they can take somebody as guilty and unrepentant as Julius Jones, a gang member in prison who's committed acts of violence in prison, a guy with a long history of armed robbery and thuggery, and turn him into an angel, give him a sneaker contract. By the way, these are actual images of sneakers that Julius Jones is designing and making money off of. He's profiting off the murder that he committed.
Third, he is designing a line of t-shirts and tennis shoes and talking about investing money. Now, we know that he did not have money when he killed Paul Howell because he was represented by a public defender as he is today. So I hope you will ask him where all this money is coming from. Is it true that he is leveraging his notoriety for financial gain? In fact, it sounded to me like he was asking the reporter in that call to help him write a book. I wish I could play so many of these calls for you because they reveal the real Julius Jones, but I simply don't have time.
And make him out to be a hero, make him out to be a saint, and smear this community, then they can do that anywhere. Oklahoma is one of the reddest states in the nation, and the fact that this is even up for discussion, the fact that this is even a dispute, is a stain on our nation as a whole. Julius Jones is 100% guilty. He murdered Paul Howell in cold blood in front of his kids, and his family are acting with such grace during the course of this.
Focus mostly on an interaction I had with a Justice for Julius supporter. The supporter reached out to our family's social media page a few weeks ago. The beginning of his message read, "I have marched for Julius numerous times, including the other day, which was on TV. I have never read the transcripts of this case, as most of his supporters have not. After careful consideration of the evidence at hand, I have completely changed my position. I am so sorry for you, for your family, just so sorry. I want to apologize for my role in misleading people about this case. I have a bunch of close friends that are leading the charge for Julius, and I am no longer participating." It was a delicate moment between me and this former supporter, two human beings having a moment of clarity and connection. I told him that I didn't blame him for his role in this campaign, and he said, "I thought it would be important for you to hear this from me," and it was.
Rachel Howe could have talked about anything during her testimony in this clemency hearing. She could have said what she said in the last hearing because it was powerful and it was beautiful, but instead she dedicated this time to reaching out to the Justice for Julius Jones people who she knows are good people who just haven't read the court documents. She talked about how these people aren't irredeemable because they don't see everyone on the other side as evil, even though what's happening to her and what's happening to her family and what happened to her father is indisputably evil. There's the evil of the murder, and then there's the evil of trying to turn the murderer into a saint and to unleash him into the public despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt that his lawyers know about and are actively lying about. That's the caliber of people that these people are compared to the other side that are just trying to get this guy off and ignore everything that he's been doing post-murder, everything that he did before the murder, and ignoring the key fact that he committed the murder. And make no mistake, this has impacted the Howell family. They are up against it. They're not only receiving threatening letters from Julius Jones, but they're also receiving mail, hatred, and vitriol from Julius Jones supporters who didn't know about this case. And one of the things that I saw recently that I want to share with you guys because I found it incredibly moving was a tweet sent to me by the Twitter account run by the Howell family. And I'm going to read it for you and hopefully not get too choked up. It's Devin Tracy, Atheism is Unstoppable, and I am Sean90, that's my Twitter account. You single-handedly led the crusade for truth and evidence in this case to be known. After seeing your videos, it gave us the strength to stand up and start speaking out. You gave us a voice and validity. Our gratitude is beyond words. Reading that from the Howell family is an honor that I never thought doing this channel where we make goofy videos would ever be sent my way, and I appreciate you guys out there for it because even though I'm making the videos and I do the research to put the evidence together, the fact is you guys watch the videos, you guys share the clips, you guys contact the governor via Twitter, via the official contact apps, and you guys have been calling in. And I see on every video that's pushing the lies about Julius Jones, you guys bringing up point after point on his guilt. I don't even have to direct you guys in there. I don't even have to respond to anything because you've been on this case. So the fact that you guys exist, and I know it's super cheesy to say it's all thanks to the audience, and you guys know for a fact I hate doing this, but the fact that you guys exist, that you make this platform work, makes this honor actually legitimate. It is your honor just as much as mine. And I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, I do appreciate what you're doing. Look, the fight isn't over. Obviously, the execution date is November 18th. The Pardon and Parole Board's recommendation is just that, a recommendation. But you guys need to be on Governor Kevin Stitt of Oklahoma up until that date. If he grants clemency, then every 6 months, Julius Jones will be eligible for one of these hearings. The Howell family will have to go every 6 months to argue to keep him in prison for the rest of their lives. And by the way, not to be super morbid or super sad, but Megan Toby is much older than Julius Jones. She was the age of Paul Howell, or actually older because Paul Howell's the baby in the family. So once she's gone and she can't defend her description in all of these hearings, what do you think is going to happen? A delay in execution is just a guarantee that Julius Jones will get out of prison. It's a guarantee that this murderer who murdered a guy in cold blood in front of his kids will become a multi-millionaire, will start doing sneaker deals, will maybe even get a documentary. This guy will become a celebrity for the murder, and it's absolutely shameful and disgusting. And you guys can put pressure on the governor to stop him. Don't let him get away with this. What they're hoping for is this side of the argument to not be heard. We've already beaten that back. We've already said that we will be heard and we will fight back against all these celebrities because none of us give a damn what Viola Davis thinks. None of us give a damn what Kim Kardashian thinks. None of us give a damn about any of these stupid celebrities who didn't look into the case at all. They watched a documentary or watched a stupid ass Now This video, and now all of a sudden they think they're advocating for change. Go out there, confront these people, respond to them, put the real evidence, link to justiceforpaulhowell.com, link to their YouTube channel, link to their Facebook page. Make sure their side of the story gets heard, but most importantly, get in contact with Governor Stitt's office. Tell him that you're watching and that you know for a fact that if he commutes the sentence of this cold-blooded murderer who murdered a good man in front of his family and kids, then this is going to destroy us as a country. This is going to show the other side that they can go into the reddest state with a red state governor and basically do whatever they want, turn a murderer into a hero, and besmirch the name of the family and the community of the murder victim. Julius Jones is 100% guilty. The farce of a media campaign, the Innocence Project, all the lies of his lawyers aren't going to change that fact. But are we going to be a nation that stands up for the victims and punishes the guilty? Or are we going to be the nation that allows lies and propaganda to overwhelm our system and turn murderers into heroes? I vote for the first one. I don't know where you guys are at. Anyway, those are just my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you like the video, you show me by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, support me via the support links in the description box. Till next time.